The ferry out of Harwich made its final crossing of the season on the morning of October the 14th, 1903, and Edmund Hale stood at its bow with his leather surveyor's case pressed against his hip, watching the coastline of Gallows Point emerge from a wall of fog so dense it seemed less like weather and more like something the land had exhaled on purpose. He had been a county land assessor for 11 years. 11 years of boundary disputes, of correcting erroneous plat maps, of walking property lines through mud and bramble so that men who would never thank him could know to the inch where their ownership ended and their neighbors began. It was meticulous, thankless work, and Edmund preferred it that way. He was not a man who sought praise. He sought accuracy. There was a quiet, unshakable dignity in measurement, in the certainty that a distance was a distance, a line was a line, and the earth beneath one's boots could be quantified, recorded, and filed. The assignment that brought him to Gallows Point was, on its surface, unremarkable: a boundary dispute. The decommissioned lighthouse at the tip of the peninsula had been federal property for decades, but the family that owned the adjacent 60-acre parcel, the Carvers, had filed a claim asserting that the lighthouse and its surrounding 2 acres had been erroneously excluded from their original 1847 deed. The state required a fresh survey before adjudication. Edmund was the man they sent. The ferry groaned against the dock at 9:20. The dock itself was a study in neglect, planks warped and silver with age, half the mooring cleats rusted to uselessness, the whole structure listing gently to starboard, as though the harbor itself were tired. A boy of perhaps 12 stood at the end of it, barefoot despite the cold, watching Edmund disembark with the flat, incurious expression of someone who had long ago stopped being surprised by strangers, but had never learned to welcome them. "Is there a boarding house in town?" Edmund asked. The boy pointed up the hill without speaking, then turned and walked away. Gallows Point was not a town so much as a scar on the land. Perhaps 40 structures in total, most of them saltbox houses with peeling clapboard and windows that reflected the gray sky like cataracts. A general store, a church with a steeple that tilted 2 degrees off plumb. Edmund noticed this instinctively and disliked it. A handful of fishing shacks along the waterline, their doors facing away from the sea, as though they too wanted nothing to do with it. The boarding house was run by a widow named Mrs. Theriot, a woman of perhaps 60, whose face had the quality of driftwood, hard, smooth, and shaped entirely by forces beyond her control. She gave Edmund a room on the 2nd floor without asking why he had come, which struck him as unusual. In his experience, the owners of small-town boarding houses were relentlessly curious. Mrs. Theriot was not. She handed him a key, told him supper was at 6, and closed her office door with a click that felt final. He spent the remainder of that first day reviewing his materials. The Carver claim rested on the assertion that the original deed, filed in 1847 by one Josiah Carver, had described the parcel's northern boundary as extending to the terminus of the rocky headland, which, if taken literally, would encompass the lighthouse grounds. The county's position was that the lighthouse had been built on a federally reserved strip, and that the deed language was imprecise, as deeds of that era so often were. Edmund had seen 100 such disputes. They were resolved by measurement, by precedent, by the patient comparison of ink on paper to stone on earth. What he had not expected was the difficulty of obtaining cooperation. The following morning, he walked to the Carver property to introduce himself and request access to the land for his survey. The house was a large 2-story federal-style structure that once had been handsome and now was merely standing. A man named Virgil Carver met him at the door, the current patriarch, perhaps 55, with a thin mouth and hands that were clean in a way that suggested he had not done physical labor in a long time. Virgil listened to Edmund's explanation of his purpose, nodded slowly, and said he was welcome to survey the land, but that the lighthouse itself was unsafe and he ought not enter it. "The stairs have rotted through. A man went in there 6 years ago and fell clean through to the cellar, broke both legs." Edmund thanked him and made a note. He would inspect the lighthouse himself and make his own determination. He began his survey that afternoon, starting at the southeastern corner of the Carver parcel and working north along the tree line. The work was slow. The terrain was brutal, loose shale, dense thickets of bayberry and rugosa rose, and a coastal wind that cut through his coat with surgical precision. The temperature hovered at perhaps 42 degrees, but the wind made it feel closer to 30. His fingers ached around his compass, his chain snagged on every stone. By the third day, he had reached the disputed northern boundary, and from there, the lighthouse was visible. It stood at the very tip of the headland, a cylindrical stone tower, perhaps 60 feet tall, its white paint long since scoured away by salt and wind to reveal the gray granite beneath. The lantern room at its crown was dark, its glass panels cracked and opaque with grime. Attached to its base was a single-story keeper's quarters, a squat, grim rectangle of stone with a slate roof and 2 narrow windows that faced the sea like closed eyes. The door to the keeper's quarters was unlocked. Edmund pushed it open and was met with the smell, a damp, mineral, deeply cold smell, like the inside of a well, the kind of cold that was not merely an absence of heat, but a presence of something else. He stepped inside. The floor was stone. The ceiling was low. A cast-iron stove sat in the corner, its pipe disconnected and hanging from the wall like a broken limb. A wooden table, a single chair, a shelf holding 3 glass jars, their contents long since evaporated to a dark residue. And, against the far wall, a wooden cabinet. He opened it expecting nothing, perhaps old tools, perhaps the remnants of a keeper's personal effects. Instead, he found documents, a great quantity of them, logbooks mostly, the kind the lighthouse board required its keepers to maintain, recording weather, lamp trimming schedules, oil consumption, and vessel sightings. There were 9 of them, spanning 1851 to 1897, their covers warped with moisture, but their pages largely intact, the ink faded to a pale brown, but still legible. Edmund was not here for logbooks. He was here to determine a property line, but he was, by nature and by profession, a man who read documents. He sat down at the table, opened the first logbook, and began. The early entries were mundane: weather observations, lamp trimming schedules, notes on oil deliveries. The handwriting belonged to a man named Asa Pettingill, the first keeper, and it was precise, economical, and without personality. But beginning in 1854, the entries changed. Pettingill began recording shipwrecks. This was not in itself unusual. Lighthouse keepers frequently noted wrecks in their logs. Coastal Maine in the mid-19th century was a graveyard for vessels. The rocks were merciless, the fog was constant, and the charts were often wrong. But the frequency was unusual. Between 1854 and 1861, Pettingill recorded 14 wrecks within sight of the lighthouse. 14 vessels driven onto the rocks of Gallows Point. In 7 of those entries, Pettingill noted that no survivors were recovered. In 4, he noted that the cargo was salvaged by local men. In 3, he noted simply, "All hands lost, no bodies found." Edmund read this and felt nothing so dramatic as alarm. He felt a question form, quiet, precise, and insistent, the way questions always formed in his mind. 14 wrecks in 7 years was high, very high, and the phrase "no bodies found," repeated 3 times, struck him as odd. The sea returns the dead, not always, but often enough. To lose every soul from 3 separate wrecks with not a single body washing ashore was improbable. He turned to the second logbook, 1862 to 1870. The keeper had changed, a man named Carver, Nathaniel Carver. He paused on the name, a carver keeping the light at Gallows Point. He noted it and continued reading. Nathaniel Carver's entries were different, longer, more detailed, and in places more troubled. He recorded 17 additional wrecks over 8 years. In 9 of those entries, the notation about cargo salvage appeared again. In 6, the "no bodies found" notation returned. But in 1 entry, dated March the 11th, 1868, Nathaniel Carver had written something that made Edmund set the logbook down and sit very still for a long moment. The resolved brig out of Portland struck the eastern reef at 2:14 a.m. I had altered the signal as instructed. The false bearing drew her onto the shoal. Cargo recovered by V. Carver and Sons at first light. 11 souls aboard. None found. God help me, none were meant to be found. Edmund read the entry a second time, then a third. The words did not change. I had altered the signal as instructed. The lighthouse keeper had deliberately changed the light pattern, the bearing, the flash sequence, the very information that mariners relied upon to navigate safely past the headland, to draw a ship onto the rocks, and the cargo had been recovered by a carver. He turned the pages faster now, no longer reading every entry but scanning for the pattern. And the pattern was there, unmistakable, systemic, and spanning decades. The logbooks told the story not in the language of confession, but in the language of record-keeping, which was, Edmund understood, far more damning. A confession could be doubted. A record, meticulous, dated, consistent, was the architecture of proof. Between 1854 and 1897, 41 vessels had been wrecked on the rocks of Gallows Point. Of those 41, at least 23 had been deliberately lured by altered light signals. The cargo, timber, wool, molasses, hardware, whale oil, and in one case, a shipment of refined silver ingots had been systematically salvaged by members of the Carver family, and in several entries by other named families in the village. The practice was not the work of a single corrupt keeper. It was an industry, a coordinated, multi-generational enterprise in which the lighthouse, the very instrument designed to save lives, had been weaponized into a killing mechanism. And the bodies. Edmund turned back to the earliest entries and began counting. 41 ships, estimated crew complements ranging from 6 to 28. Conservative arithmetic placed the total number of sailors aboard those vessels at somewhere between 300 and 400 souls. Of those, the logbooks recorded fewer than 40 survivors, men pulled from the water by keepers or villagers in cases where witnesses from passing ships made a complete disappearance impossible. The rest, perhaps 360 human beings, were listed as lost. No bodies recovered, no graves marked, no names sent to families. 360 people do not simply vanish from the surface of the earth. Edmund closed the last logbook and sat in the keeper's quarters as the afternoon light failed, and the cold deepened, and the wind pressed against the stone walls with the patience of something that had been pressing for a long time. He understood now why Virgil Carver had warned him away from the lighthouse. He understood the reluctance of the townspeople, the silence of Mrs. Theriot, the averted eyes of the boy on the dock. He understood, with the clarity that only evidence could provide, that Gallows Point had not merely been built near tragedy, it had been built upon it, funded by it, fed by it. He needed to know where the bodies were. The answer came not from the logbooks, but from his own survey. On the 5th day, while remeasuring the western boundary of the Carver parcel, he noticed a discrepancy. The elevation readings along a 200-yard stretch of the lower meadow did not match the surrounding terrain. The ground was approximately 3 feet higher than the natural grade. A long, low, almost imperceptible rise in the earth, like a swell frozen in place. It was the kind of anomaly that most men would walk over without a second thought. Edmund was not most men. He drove a probe rod into the soil at 12-inch intervals across the width of the rise. At a depth of 31 inches, the rod struck something that was neither stone nor clay. It had a different resistance, a faint, brittle give. He withdrew the rod and examined its tip. Stained, a dark reddish-brown discoloration in the soil clinging to the metal. He did not dig further. He did not need to. The meadow was the grave. 200 yards long, perhaps 20 yards wide, a mass burial site, layered over decades, covered with topsoil and planted with grass so that the land would heal over its own wound and the secret would become, literally, part of the ground.
That evening, Edmund sat in his room at Mrs. Theriot's boarding house and wrote his report. The survey was complete. The boundary measurements were precise. The Carver claim, based on the original deed language, had technical merit. The parcel did, by the letter of the 1847 description, extend to the terminus of the headland. He noted this finding with the dispassionate clarity his profession demanded. He did not include the logbooks in his official report. He considered it. He sat with the pen above the paper for a long time, listening to the wind move through the clapboards of the old house, listening to the distant sound of the sea against the rocks below the village, and he considered what would happen if he did. The logbooks would be entered into evidence. There would be an investigation. The Carver family would deny everything. The village would close ranks. The logbooks would be challenged as forgeries or the ravings of disturbed men. Lawyers would be retained. Years would pass. The meadow would remain undisturbed because no court would order an excavation based on the diary entries of dead lighthouse keepers and the soil samples of a land assessor who had exceeded his mandate. And even if, by some extraordinary turn, the truth were proven, what then? The men who had altered the lights were dead. The men who had salvaged the cargo were dead. The men who had carried bodies from the shoreline to the meadow in the dark of night were dead. Only their descendants remained, living in the houses their grandfathers built with the proceeds of plunder, walking to church on Sundays over the very ground where the unnamed dead lay in their compressed and silent rows.
Edmund Hale packed the logbooks into his surveyor's case. He carried them with him onto the ferry the following morning. He told himself he was preserving evidence. He told himself he would find the right authority, the right moment, the right avenue through which the truth could surface and matter. He never did. The logbooks sat in a drawer in his office in Augusta for the remaining 31 years of his career. He retired in 1934. He died in 1939. His personal effects were donated to the County Historical Society, where a clerk cataloged the logbooks as lighthouse service records, provenance unclear, and placed them in a storage room in the basement, where they remain to this day, unread. Gallows Point still exists. The lighthouse was torn down in 1922, its stone repurposed for a seawall. The Carver house still stands, though it has changed hands twice. The Meadow is still there, that long, low, almost imperceptible rise in the earth along the western boundary. Wildflowers grow there in the summer, goldenrod and aster and Queen Anne's lace, their roots reaching down into soil that is darker and richer than the surrounding clay, fed by minerals that no one speaks of, nourished by a silence that has lasted over a century. 360 souls, give or take, sailors from Portland and Boston and Halifax and St. John, men with names and families and debts and hopes and the ordinary, fragile expectation that a light on the shore meant safety. They sailed towards it because that is what a light is supposed to mean. Come this way, you are seen, you will be guided home. They were seen, but not the way they believed. And perhaps that is the cruelest architecture of all human evil. Not the act itself, but the perversion of trust, the corruption of the very symbols we build to protect one another. A light that means danger, a keeper who keeps nothing safe, a village that watches from its windows as the sea does its work, and then walks down to the shore at dawn to collect what remains. Edmund Hale understood this. He understood it with the precision of a man who measured the world for a living and who discovered on a cold October week in 1903 that some distances cannot be measured, some boundaries cannot be drawn, and some truths once uncovered simply sit in a drawer and wait for someone, anyone, to find them worthy of grief. No one has yet. The flowers in the meadow bloom every summer. The wind off the Atlantic carries the smell of salt and stone, and the earth holds what it holds, patient and indifferent, asking nothing of the living except the one thing the living have always found easiest to give: their silence.